Another had a scar running from ear to collar. The third, clearly the later, had the careful eyes of a man who counted profit before risk and blood before trust. When he saw Alec standing on the shore in torn clothes and oil-stained hands, he frowned. "Well," the man said, "either this island grows knights now, or the dead have learned posture." Alec did not smile. "Depends what you're buying." The sailors exchanged glances. The leader stepped closer. "You live here?" "For now. Then you're either mad or very hard to kill. Both have kept me alive." That earned the faintest twitch at the corner of the man's mouth. "My ship took damage in the rocks 2 nights ago," the sailor said. "We need fresh water, maybe timber if the island somehow grows miracles, and lamp oil if you have any." His eyes swept over Alec's ragged shelter in the distance. "Though I'm guessing you don't." Alec lifted the wrapped jar in one hand. "I might." That brought silence. The sailor stared. "From where?" Alec looked past him toward the cliffs. "From Blackwake." One of the others barked a laugh. "What? Do you squeeze it out of the stones?" "In a way." Before Alec could lead them inland, the scarred sailor stepped closer and looked him over with open contempt. "Captain," the man said, "why are we bargaining with him? He's alone." The leader's eyes narrowed slightly. "Careful, Rusk." But Rusk had already mistaken torn clothing for weakness. He stepped into Alec's space and reached for the wrapped jar. "Let's see what the dead knight is hiding." Alec's hand closed around his wrist. The movement was calm. The pressure was not. Rusk's grin disappeared as Alec's fingers tightened like an iron clamp. The sailor tried to pull free. Alec turned his wrist outward, shifted his foot, and slammed him face first into the whetstone with one clean motion. The other sailor drew a knife. Alec kicked the fallen man's blade from his belt, caught it in the air, and pointed it at the second sailor's throat before the man completed his step. Everything stopped. The waves crashed behind them. The leader slowly raised one hand, not to Alec, but to his own crew. "Put it away," he said. The second sailor swallowed and lowered his knife. Alec released Rusk only after the man stopped struggling. The scarred sailor rolled onto his back, coughing seawater and blood from a split lip. Alec looked down at him. "I am selling fuel," he said, "not begging for mercy." Rusk glared, but he didn't stand. The leader studied Alec with new interest. The torn clothes, the oil-stained hands, the hollow eyes from smoke and hunger, those had hidden the man underneath. Now he saw him properly, not a castaway, not a prisoner, a trained killer standing on his own shore. The leader's smile returned, slower this time. "Well," he said, "that answers one question." Alec lifted the jar again. What question was that? Whether Blackwake's only resident was worth robbing. Alec's gaze did not move. "He isn't." The man laughed once and gestured toward the rocks. "Then show me this miracle fuel, Sir Not a Beggar." Alec led them a short distance inland where the wind was weaker, set the jar on a flat stone, and fitted a cloth wick into the shallow mouth. Then, without ceremony, he struck flint and lit it. The flame rose in a low amber tongue. Not pretty, not clean, but strong. The sailors leaned in. The leader sniffed, grimaced at the smell, then watched the flame hold steady through the breeze. "How long?" he asked. "This amount?" Alec said. "Long enough to justify paying for it." The sailor crouched, studying the burn like a priest examining a relic. "It smokes." "Less than fish fat." "It stinks." "Less than rotting whale oil." The second sailor grunted. "He's not wrong." The leader stood and folded his arms. "How much do you have?" "3 jars ready. More if I choose to make them." "If you choose." Alec met his eyes. "You're not negotiating with a beggar. You're negotiating with the only man on this sea who can sell you fuel from a dead island." That did it. The leader laughed, short and sharp with genuine surprise. "There is a spine under all that soot after all." He introduced himself as Bram Voss, captain of the Morning Tide, a small, independent trader with no questions he could not afford answered. He had come close to Blackwake by necessity, not courage, after a storm and a damaged stern lamp left his crew half-blind at sea. Under normal circumstances, he would never have bought fuel from a stranger marooned on cursed rock. But necessity, Alec knew, was the mother of every profitable bargain. Bram tested the fuel himself that evening aboard his vessel. He burned 1 jar through the ship's stern lamp and used part of another in a lantern below deck. The smoke annoyed him. The smell annoyed everyone. But the fuel worked. By morning, he returned to shore with the expression of a man who had found value in a place he did not trust. "I'll buy the lot," Bram said. "For what price?" Bram named a number so insulting it almost became impressive. Alec looked at him in silence for 3 full seconds, then turned as if to walk away. "Hold," Bram called. "You haven't even countered. I don't bargain with men who mistake exile for desperation." Bram's eyes narrowed. "And what do you mistake it for?" "Leverage," Alex said without turning. "You need fuel now. I need coin once. Only one of those needs repeats." That made Bram pause. The captain was not dealing with a stranded fool. He was dealing with a man who understood scarcity, urgency, and pride well enough to weaponize all three. After a longer exchange, they settled on a fairer price. Not generous, but real, enough to matter. When Bram dropped the small leather pouch of silver and copper into Alec's hand, the weight of it felt heavier than coins should. It was the first money Alec Arden had earned since the day the kingdom cast him away. Not by title, not by royal favor, not by the sword, by the black blood of Black Wake. Bram also sold him extras before leaving. 2 intact clay jars, a better knife, a bundle of coarse cloth, dried meat, nails, lamp hooks, and most precious of all, a length of narrow copper tubing from damaged ship stores that the captain had considered worthless scrap. Alec did not react visibly when he saw it, but inside something tightened with focus. Copper meant refinement. Refinement meant improvement. Improvement meant scale. Before departing, Bram gave him one final look. "You know what happens if word spreads about this place?" "Yes." "Men will come." Alec closed his hand around the coin pouch. "Then I should be ready before they do." Bram smirked. "You talk like you plan to own the island." Alec looked up at the black ridges rising behind him, at the cliffs that had nearly become his grave, at the cracked stone bleeding wealth no one else had recognized. Then he answered, calm as ever, "I plan to build something the kingdom will regret losing." The morning tide sailed before noon. Alec stood on the shore until it vanished into mist, then turned back toward his shelter with supplies under one arm, silver at his belt, and the copper tubing gripped like a promise. The island no longer felt silent. It felt waiting. That night he spread everything he had gained across the stone floor of the ruined shed, and began planning in earnest. Better storage, more collection points, a larger fire pit, clay settling basins, improved lamps, a real distillation attempt. Perhaps if he could shape the copper properly and seal the clay well enough. A crude condenser. He barely slept. At dawn, Alec climbed once more to the southern cliffs where the oil seeped from the stone. He stood there in the cold morning wind, staring down at the black liquid gathering in the cracks, and for the first time he did not see survival. He saw industry, furnaces, workshops, barrels, docks, ships lined in harbor waiting for fuel, coins pouring into hands that had once scraped roots from hard soil. He saw Blackwake transformed, and as the first pale light of day touched the dark rock, Alec crouched beside the largest seep yet, pressed his fingers to the warm black flow, and smiled. This island had paid him once. Next time it would pay enough to hire men. And once men came, Blackwake would never belong to the king again. Coin changed the way Alec Arden looked at the island. Before Bram Voss arrived, Blackwake had been a prison made of wind, salt, and stubborn endurance. Every cliff was an obstacle, every path was a burden, every day was measured by what little he could drag from the land without dying. Now he saw the island differently. The ridges were watch points, the coves were future docks. The clay beds inland were not mud but material. The black seep in the southern cliffs was no longer a curiosity. It was a vein of power. And power, Alec knew, was meaningless unless it could be organized. That was why the silver from the morning tide mattered more than the food or tools Bram had sold him. Those could keep him alive a little longer. The money, however, meant leverage. It meant that when another ship appeared, he would not be standing on the shore like a starving castaway with a single dirty jar in his hand. He would be ready. For the next several days, Alec worked with a purpose sharper than hunger. The copper tubing Bram had called scrap became the center of his attention. It was narrow, slightly bent, and stained green in places from long neglect, but it was intact enough to matter. Alec cleaned it with sand, seawater, and a knife until the worst corrosion came away. Then he began designing, in the roughest possible terms, a primitive refining setup. He did not need elegance, he needed separation. The crude oil from the cliffs was too raw to build a real trade on. It burned, yes, but unpredictably. Some batches smoked heavily, others flared dangerously. If he wanted repeat buyers, he needed consistency. Something that could be produced the same way, sold the same way, and trusted enough that merchants would return rather than curse his name across every port from here to the capital. So he built his first still. It was laughably primitive by any scholar standards. A broad clay pot for heating, a fitted lid hammered together from salvaged metal strips and packed with wet clay to reduce leakage, the copper tube fixed through one side and at the far end, a smaller receiving vessel half buried in cool wet sand to encourage condensation. It looked less like a triumph of engineering and more like a drunk blacksmith's apology. But Alec had seen war machines made from worse. The first test nearly killed him. He heated too fast. Pressure built under the sealed lid, and before he could pull back, the wet clay around the seam burst with a wet crack. A spray of hot vapor and oil splattered across the stones, and Alec threw himself sideways just in time. The edge of the burst clipped his left forearm, burning a strip of skin red and angry from wrist to elbow. He rolled, cursed, and lay there breathing hard, while black smoke crawled upward into the cold air. Pain pulsed through his arm. Slowly Alec sat up and stared at the wreckage. Then he laughed under his breath. Again, that was becoming a habit on Blackwake. Too tight, he muttered. Too hot. Too fast. He reworked the setup that same day. This time he left a small vent gap, reduced the seal, cooled the receiving vessel better, and fed the fire in slower increments. The process took longer, painfully longer, but when the first thin stream of condensed liquid finally slid through the copper tube and dripped into the waiting clay cup, Alec felt a sharper thrill than he had when he made his first sale. Because this was different. The earlier fuel had been scraped from chance and filtered through effort. This, if it worked, was refinement. He waited until the cup held a shallow pool, then let the apparatus cool before testing it. The liquid was lighter than the raw crude, thinner. It still carried a harsh smell, but not the same suffocating heaviness as before. Alec soaked a new cloth wick, placed it in a lamp bowl, and lit it. The flame rose cleaner. Still rough. Still imperfect, but cleaner. It burned brighter than the crude fuel he had sold to Bram, with less smoke and a steadier body to the flame. Alec watched it for a long moment, then looked back toward the southern cliffs. The island had just become much more valuable. Over the next 2 weeks, his work changed pace entirely. No longer was he merely testing whether Blackwake's oil could be useful. He now knew it could. The question had become, how much could he produce before exhaustion, weather, or lack of labor crushed the opportunity in its cradle? That answer, unfortunately, was not much. Alec could collect crude alone. He could refine alone. He could shape clay vessels, maintain fire, monitor burns, and watch the sea alone. He could not do all of it well at the same time and continue expanding. Blackwake needed hands. That realization came with both opportunity and risk. More people meant more production. More production meant more sales. But more people also meant less secrecy. On a different kind of story, that might have frightened him. Here, Alec simply accepted it as the next unavoidable stage. No business grew from one man clutching a secret in a cave forever. Sooner or later, he would need workers. The key was choosing men with nowhere better to go, and every reason to stay loyal. Blackwake, fortunately, was the sort of place desperate men already drifted toward when the world had no use for them. The first arrived by accident. A fishing skiff nearly shattered itself against the eastern rocks during a storm, and Alec spotted it from the ridge just before dusk. He ran down the rain-slick path with rope tied around his waist and found 2 men half drowned in the surf, dragging themselves and a damaged cargo bundle toward shore. One was old, broad-shouldered, and gray-bearded, with hands like split oak and a face carved by years of hard labor. The other was younger, thinner, and clearly too weak from hunger to stand without swaying. Alec helped them into the ruined shed without asking questions first. Only once they had heat, dry cloth, and something hot in their stomachs did he begin learning who they were. The older man's name was Garin Hale. He had once been a shipwright in the western docks of Ilarion, respected enough to oversee hull repairs on military vessels until a royal tax official accused him of withholding materials. Whether the accusation had been true or not hardly mattered now. He had lost his workshop, his license, and eventually his home. Since then, he had drifted from port to port doing repair work for smugglers, fishermen, and anyone willing to ignore his record. The younger man was called Thomas, a dock laborer's son, who had followed Garin after famine and debt stripped his family of everything else. Their skiff had been trying to cut south toward a minor island port when the storm pushed them off course. "You realize where you landed?" Alec asked once Garin had regained enough strength to sit upright. The older man glanced around the shelter at the clay jars, the soot-dark walls, the strange metal piping, and finally at Alec himself. "On cursed rock by the look of it. Blackwake." Thomas paled immediately. Garin only grunted. "Thought so." Alec studied him. "You don't seem surprised. I'm too tired to waste fear." That answer earned him a measure of respect. When morning came, Alec brought Garin and Thomas to the southern shelves. He showed them the black seep. He showed them the crude collection pits he had dug and lined with stone. Then he showed them the still. Garin stared longest at that. He walked around it once, slow and silent, then crouched beside the clay base and tapped the fittings with a rough knuckle. His brows drew together, not in ridicule, but in the sort of professional offense a craftsman felt when seeing something ugly that nonetheless functioned. "You built this?" Garin asked. "Yes, with no proper forge?" "Yes, with almost no tools." "Yes." Garin stood and looked at him fully for the first time. "Then you're either gifted or insane." Alec gave the same answer as before. Both have been useful. For the first time, the old shipwright barked a dry laugh. That laugh mattered more than either man realized. Because once Garin stopped looking at Blackwake like a cursed grave, and started looking at it like a problem to be solved, the island changed again. He saw what Alec had seen. Not ruin. Structure waiting to happen. The damaged skiff could be cannibalized for wood and nails. The eastern cove could, with work, support a landing platform. The shed could be reinforced. Storage pits could be dug. Rain catchments could be improved. Barrel frames, racks, shelves, and support braces could be built if only the materials were gathered properly. In exchange for food, shelter, and a cut of future profits, Garin agreed to stay. Thomas followed without protest. Just like that, Alec Arden had his first men. The three of them fell into a brutal but efficient rhythm. Alec oversaw oil collection, testing, and negotiations whenever ships appeared. Garin repaired and reinforced everything that touched human hands. Thomas carried water, clay, firewood, and crewed under ceaseless instruction from both men, until his arms shook by sunset every day. The work was merciless. Blackwake was not gentle to those who tried to tame it. One day, the southern paths became slick with sea spray and nearly sent Tomas over a cliff with a load of crude jars. Alec caught him by the collar at the last second, dragged him back, and said only one thing: "Slow hands live longer." Another day, a clay vessel burst during heating and scorched part of the shed wall black. Twice, strong winds nearly ruined the cooling process for the refined batches. And always there was the smell, the clinging, bitter scent of oil and smoke that seemed to soak itself into skin, cloth, even sleep. Yet the island was changing. By the end of the month, the ruined shed had become a true workshop. Not a grand one, not yet. But it had reinforced beams salvaged from the skiff, raised storage shelves, improved fire pits, better clay molds, and 2 functioning stills instead of 1. Garin reshaped Alec's original design with a craftsman's eye, widening the heating basin slightly, stabilizing the copper support, and creating a better cooling trench for the receiving vessel. The results were immediate. Production increased, quality improved, waste dropped. Alec began separating output into grades. The best refined batch became lamp fuel. The heavier, dirtier residues he set aside and experimented with as grease. That second idea came from memory. During campaign seasons, he had watched supply crews fight endlessly with wagon axles, hinges, pulleys, and metal fittings that wore down too quickly under bad maintenance and cheap lubricant. Animal fat spoiled, poor tar mixtures stiffened or failed under strain. If Blackwake's heavier oil fractions could be thickened and blended into something useful for mechanisms, carts, or ships, then his value to buyers would double. The first grease batches were crude, black, and ugly enough to offend civilized eyes. But when Garin smeared a little over the rusted hinge of the old store hatch and worked it back and forth, the result was immediate. The hinge stopped shrieking. Garin lifted a brow. Well, Alec crouched beside him. Well? The old shipwright tested it again, then nodded slowly. It's filth, but useful filth. On Blackwake, that counted as praise. The island's next buyer came sooner than expected. Bram Voss returned. This time, the morning tide approached Blackwake with less caution and more calculation. The captain had spread word sparingly, careful enough not to trigger a rush of bigger predators too soon, but not careful enough to keep his own curiosity from bringing him back. When he stepped ashore and saw not one half-starved exile but 3 working men, stacked jars, reinforced structures, and smoke rising from organized fire pits, his expression changed from amusement to professional concern. "You move quickly," Bram said. "I move because I have reason to," Alec replied. Bram eyed the rows of clay vessels. "How much?" Alec gave him the number. The captain actually whistled. "That much from this rock?" "Enough for your lamps," Alec said, "and enough to make you money reselling in ports that ask fewer questions than the capital." Bram's grin sharpened. "There it is. I was wondering when the knight would learn commerce. I learned it the day I understood loyalty doesn't pay wages." That line stayed with Bram longer than Alec intended. The captain tested the new fuel and immediately saw the difference. It still was not noble house quality, but it was significantly cleaner than before. More importantly, Alec now offered 2 products instead of 1. Refined lamp oil and thick black lubricant, useful for ship fittings, pulley assemblies, and damaged gear housings. Bram bought all of it. Not cheaply either. Alec negotiated harder this time. He now had labor, better output, and proof of repeat quality. Bram tried his usual tricks, but Alec had already learned the captain's habits. The false sigh before a low offer, the little pause when something mattered more than he wanted to admit, the way his eyes flicked toward scarcity before agreeing. By the time the deal closed, Bram was still smiling, but it was the smile of a man who knew he had not won. In return, Alec bought smarter. Not luxuries, not comfort. Assets, hammerheads, fish hooks, rope, more cloth. A shovel that was not already rusting into uselessness. 2 metal hoops for reinforcing larger barrels. A whetstone, salt, grain, dried beans, a real handsaw. And, most importantly, word. "Bring me men," Alec told Bram as the cargo was exchanged. Bram arched a brow. What kind? Not thieves who think one night's theft makes them kings. Not drunkards who'd burn the place down by accident. "I want men with skills, or men desperate enough to respect structure." That narrows the ports considerably. "Good. I'm not building a tavern. I'm building an industry." Bram leaned against a crate, studying him with frank curiosity now. "You really intend to turn Blackwake into something?" Alec's gaze shifted to the ridges above them, where the evening wind rolled over black stone and unfinished paths. "No," he said quietly. "I intend to turn it into somewhere the kingdom cannot ignore." Bram said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once. When the morning tide sailed away again, it carried more than cargo. It carried the first real whisper of Blackwake's worth. And whispers, Alec knew, were dangerous things. The first real threat came 3 nights after Bram's second departure. It did not come with banners, it came with oars wrapped in cloth. Alec was awake when he heard them. Soft splashes below the eastern cove. too controlled for fishermen, too careful for lost sailors. He stepped outside the workshop, oil lamp covered in one hand, knife in the other, and looked down toward the black water. A boat slid between the rocks, then another. 6 men climbed onto the shore. They carried short blades, hooks, and empty sacks. Raiders, not soldiers, not merchants. Just hungry men who had heard enough whispers to believe Blackwake held something valuable, but not enough to understand who guarded it. Alec woke Garen with one touch to the shoulder. "Get Thomas behind the storage pit," he whispered. Garen saw the figures below and cursed under his breath. "How many?" 6. Against 3? Alec's eyes remained on the cove. Against Blackwake. The raiders moved toward the workshop, low and fast. Their leader pointed at the stacked jars near the outer wall. One man reached for them. That was when Alec kicked over the first prepared clay bowl. Oil-slick sludge spilled across the path. The raider stepped into it and lost his footing instantly. Before he could shout, Alec came out of the darkness and drove the shovel handle into his throat. The man dropped without a sound. The second turned. Alec hit him with the lamp. The covered flame shattered against the ground, igniting the thin oil trail Alec had laid earlier that evening for testing drainage. Fire crawled across the stones in a sudden orange line, cutting the raiders from their boats. Panic broke their formation. Garen appeared from the side with a shipwright's mallet and smashed one attacker's knee sideways. The crack was ugly. The scream was worse. Thomas, shaking but determined, hurled a clay jar from behind the storage pit. It broke against another raider's chest, splashing him with thick black residue. The man staggered backward, clawing at his eyes. Alec moved through them like a ghost from an older war. One raider swung a hook at his face. Alec ducked, stepped inside the ark, and drove his knife into the man's shoulder, twisting just enough to disable the arm without killing him. Another tried to rush from behind. Alec caught the movement by sound alone, pivoted, and slammed his elbow into the man's nose. Blood burst across the firelight. The leader shouted, "Kill him! It's just one night!" Alec looked at him through the smoke. That was the worst thing he could have said. For a moment, Alec was no longer on Blackwake. He was back at Varric Fortress, standing amid broken shields and burning ladders while enemy soldiers screamed his name in fear. The raider leader charged. Alec let him come. At the last second, he shifted left, caught the man's wrist, and used his own momentum to throw him into the burning oil line. The leader crashed hard, rolled away from the flames, and came up screaming with one sleeve burning. Alec stepped on his sword hand. The blade clattered free. Then Alec placed the knife under his chin. "Who sent you?" The raider leader spat blood. "No one. Heard there was oil, thought island rats would be easy." Alec leaned closer. "You found the wrong rats. By dawn, 2 raiders were dead, 3 were bound, and 1 had escaped into the sea with burns on his arm and terror in his lungs." Alec let that one go. Garen noticed. "You missed him?" the old shipwright asked. Alec watched the fleeing boat vanish into morning fog. "No, then why?" Alec wiped blood from his knife. "Because fear travels faster than trade." The bound raiders stared at him in silence. That morning, Alec made new rules for Blackwake. No worker slept without a weapon nearby. No storage stayed unguarded. No path remained unprepared. No boat approached without being seen. The island was no longer just a workshop. It was becoming a fortress. That night, after the fires had dimmed and Thomas had finally fallen asleep where he sat, Garen remained outside the workshop, sharpening tools beneath the glow of one of the refined lamps. Alec stepped out beside him. For a while, neither man spoke. The sea crashed below the cliffs. The lamp burned steadily. Blackwake smelled of salt, clay, smoke, blood, and oil. Finally, Garin said, "You know they'll come harder once word spreads. Yes, merchants first, then smugglers, then men with seals and titles who decide what you built should belong to them. Yes, and when they do," Alec looked down toward the southern shelves where the black seep still bled from the stone in endless slow patience. "When they do," he said, "they'll find this island already has an owner." Garin studied him in silence, then gave one slow nod. Not to a noble, not to a commander, to a man worth following. Above them, Blackwake's winds howled over the dark ridges like the island itself had begun to awaken. And for the first time since his exile, Alec Arden was no longer merely surviving on cursed land. He was building the foundation of power. One worker, one sail, one furnace, one weapon, one flame at a time.